Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say to you, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the tree of the fruit in the trees of the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths." Before we go on, we're going to stop here. This is the first real movement we see happening in this narrative. This is the temptation. Now let's unpack this a little bit, because Genesis 3 is full of really weird stuff. We see a talking snake, which isn't typical in my experience of snakes. We see, mankind choosing to reject God for the sake of a piece of fruit, and it doesn't really make much sense. All this comes back to man's disobedience comes back to this lie of when the serpent challenged, Eve to, "Did God say you can't eat this fruit? Did he actually say you need to obey me? You shouldn't disobey me in this one area?" He twists this around, and when she answers and says, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat, your eyes will be open, knowing good and evil." Now this term, knowing good and evil, goes far beyond just cognitive knowledge, intellectual knowledge. In fact, the word we have for knowing is mentioned a couple times throughout this passage, but in Genesis 4, it says that Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, a son. So knowing here has something to do with intimacy. See, what the serpent is proposing is that Adam and Eve should, or Eve in this case specifically, should take some of this fruit so that she can in some ways experience evil, that can kind of become part of who she is. The problem here isn't the fruit. The problem is the lie on the other side of the fruit. Nate Larkin was a speaker at the Covenant Brotherhood and Barbecue recently, and I think his story kind of helps us understand about the lie behind the fruit a little bit better. Throughout his life, he's dealt with sexual addiction, and he estimates conservatively he spent about $300,000 on pornography or prostitutes. His life had fallen apart. His marriage was, just completely in the tank. And he went to a sex anonymous group, and there he saw one of his friends. And his friend confronted him and said, sex isn't your biggest problem. And of course, Nate was kind of taken aback of I'm pretty sure this is my biggest problem. I've spent more money on this, more time on this, more energy on this than anything else. But his friend said, sex isn't your biggest problem. It's your favorite solution. And that's what the serpent is telling the woman here. He isn't saying, okay, this fruit, once you take this is going to be the great thing. The fruit is a means to a greater end. Now, if you're an Israelite thinking about disobeying God, which if you're familiar with them, they do quite often, this will be kind of familiar to you. Think about when they had just escaped the Egyptians and they were wandering out in the desert. They knew, okay, we need to keep walking, keep going. This is what obedience to God looks like, going forward through the desert. But then they start to remember, and they start to get this idea of, well, what if we went back to Egypt? When we went back, we had plenty to eat. Yeah, the conditions weren't great, but we'd kind of prefer that to going forward. Sin does the same for us. It offers itself as an alternative solution to obeying God. Sin appeals both to our emotions and our intellect. That's one of the big flaws, I think, in Reform circles, is that and the sun is slowly creeping in, is that we firmly believe that our emotions are fallen, but we don't always recognize that our ability to reason is fallen as well. Just listen to this. In attacking the woman here, in verse 6, she says, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that this tree was desired to make one wise, she took its fruit and ate. How many of us have struggled with sin because we believe that lie? That there's something out there that we should take a hold, that makes sense, that feels right. That there's something out there that if we just have that, then we'll be complete, then we'll be happy. How many of us look at something that God has forbidden us and has asked us to obey us by not pursuing that, and we've gone after it anyway? Because it makes sense. Sin sometimes to us in a fallen world makes sense, but that temptation doesn't pay off. Giving in to sin doesn't pay off, and we're about to see that.